Hi, welcome to the next video on the channel. I am Aquib, and in this one, we are going to discuss how to fetch API data using ReactJS. So we'll create a new React application and then see how we can fetch external data from an API and display it within our React component. So let's jump in and get started. Before we start writing the code, let us take a quick look at the steps that we have to go through to get this done. The very first step is to initialize the React project. Then we'll create the required components. Then we'll create the state variables to store the API data that will come in. Then we'll fetch the API data. And finally, we'll display that data out on the screen. Now we're going to use two hooks here. We'll work with the useState hook for creating the state variables. And then we'll work with the useEffect hook to actually fetch the data. Let's start with the very first step, which is to initialize the React project. So let's head to VS Code here. And I already have a folder open. As you can see, the terminal is also open. Let's run our command. That's npx create react app. And then the name of the application, which is going to be fetch-api-data. Remember, you cannot use capital letters in the app name. So make sure it's all lowercase. Now, in the meanwhile that this is getting created, let us actually take a look at Material UI, which is the component that we need to use. So this is the official website, that's mui.com. Over here, we can find a bunch of amazing React components, as you can see on the right hand side. Before we actually look at the component, let's see how we can install this. So let's go to docs, MUI core, Material UI. Scroll down to the installation section, click on that, and then here we'll get the command to install Material UI and all its related packages. So I'll copy this. Let's head back to VS Code. Our folder is now created, which means our project is in place. So let's head inside the folder and then paste that command. This will install everything that we need from Material UI. So that's done. Now let me actually show you the component as well as the data that we're working with. The component that I'm looking for is called a card. So I'll just search for it and click on the first option that shows up. When I scroll down, you can see this is what a card looks like. We have a couple more variations at the bottom as well. So if you see here, we have a lizard card where we have an image, we have the title or the name of the person probably, and two links. We can also go with this card if you feel like it. This is also something that we can experiment with. So this is for you to pick and choose. I'm going to go with the lizard card for this one. So we can click on the show code button. So if it's in the TypeScript mode by default, switch it to JavaScript and then we can copy the code. Then we can head back to our application and I'm going to replace the entire app.js component with this one. So I've just copied and pasted everything on the existing app.js component and I've removed everything from the app component for now. Now, let me also show you the API that we're working with. So that's the random user generator. Let me just zoom out so that we can see this better. So this is what the API does. Every time we refresh the API URL, you can see we get a random user's details. This is what we're trying to use. And the API endpoint is randomuser.me/API. So if I zoom in here, you can see that we get a bunch of data about a user over here. So we get the gender, name, location, city, state, country, the time zone, location coordinates, email, login information, date of birth, etc. And every time we reload, every time we hit the endpoint again, the details change. So here we have Miss Anna, for example, then we have Miss Lillian, then we have Mr. Corey. So the details will change on every reload. This is the data that we're working with, and this is the component that we have in place. Let me copy this API endpoint, and now let's go ahead and move to the next step. So if we quickly get back to our timeline here, we are done with the first step. We have initialized the project. We have also copy pasted the component that we need. So step 2 is also done. That brings us to step 3, where we have to create the state variables. Now let me just close off the terminal here for a minute and we can see the data that we have here for the component. This is the first part, which is the image bit. Then we have the name of the user, which we'll put in here. We don't really need this description bit, so I'll remove that one. And then we'll keep the buttons, but instead of the share and learn more, we'll just put the phone number and email over here. Now we also need to create a state variable to store that data. For this, we're going to need two hooks. So let's import them. We need useState to create the state variable and then useEffect to fetch the API data. Both of these are coming from React. All right. Then we can create the state variable within our component. So that will be const. Let's call it user data and then set user data, which is a set function for it or the set method for it, and then we'll use state, and by default we'll keep it to an empty array. Now I know for a fact that the API is going to give us an empty array here, but you can always double check with the API response. So that's the third step checked off as well. That brings us to step number 4, where we have to actually fetch the API data. So let's head back and try to connect to the API. For this, we need to use the useEffect hook. So useEffect, and the structure here is very important. So we have to make an arrow function, and then we need to put empty square brackets. Now let me quickly explain to you what is going on. UseEffect is the hook which will run every time the component is rendered. So whenever a component is rendered on the screen, be it the first time or be it rendering again later on after another component is gone from the screen, useEffect will be called. So this particular arrow function will be called every time useEffect is called. And then if we wanted to manually refresh or if we wanted to run again, we can specify parameters here. So based on what we specify here, the useEffect can be triggered again. But for now, we don't really want that. We want it to trigger only once to fetch the data when the component loads up for the very first time. So for that, we can now use a couple of different techniques. What I'm going to go for is the default fetch method or the built-in fetch method available in JavaScript. You can also use packages such as Axios at this point. But to keep it simple, we'll stick to the fetch API. Over here, I'm going to paste the URL. So that's randomuser.me/API. Once that comes in, so then we'll take the data and we'll say return response.json. We'll convert it to JSON data, right? So that's the next step. And then after this is done, so after we have the JSON data, then we will do one more step, which is to set that value to the user data. So again, over here, we can have another then, we can chain another then method. And then let me just save it. So over here, we'll then take the data, which is the output, and then we can say set user data to the data that we now have. So this is the structure for the whole setup. As you can see, this looks much better now once it spaces out properly. So again, we are first trying to fetch the data. Once we get the data, then we are setting it or converting it to JSON. So this should be like this. And then once that is done, we are actually setting it to the variable. After this, if you want, you can also chain another then to just log the data. So we can say console.log user data so that we can actually see the data that has been stored in the state variable. So let's quickly test it out now. Let's head over to the terminal and run our application. So that's npm start, but make sure we are in the correct folder. So first let's cd into the folder and then we can run npm start. This should pull up the application for us in the browser. And then if we head over to the console, we should be able to see the data as well. So let's check. So if everything is right, then we should see the data in the console and we can see something being displayed, but the data is not coming in. I think that's because of some error in this line. So let's double check. So one quick modification that I can do here is to actually return it explicitly. So that way it should work fine. And let's double check. So now you can see we get the data in our terminal or in our console. And this is exactly what we were looking for. So make sure you return response.json. And then we can also put these two things in a single line if we want. So I can take the console log and put that in over there. After we set the user data, we can write a console statement and remove that additional then. So again, we can restructure our code a little bit. And now you can see we get the data in the console. Once the data comes to the console, we are now down to the final step, which is to display data in the component. So let's quickly take care of that as well. So in order to display that data within the component, let us first observe the actual structure. So first we have a results array, and in that zeroth index, of that array, we have name, we have email, we have cell, which are all the different data points that we're looking for. So we have phone, we have cell, etc. So let's head over to our code and try to figure this out now. So again, we have the data available here in user data. What we want to do is we want to go ahead and probably add the user name over here. So this is where we add that lizard part. And to add this, we can use curly brackets. And then we can say user data dot results. Within that, we have to access index 0. Then dot say phone. This should give us access to the phone number. We don't actually want it here, but we want it there. And if I paste it one more time, we can change it with email. So now if we go back to our output, you can see that we have the cell number and the email showing up. In the exact same way, we can quickly add the other data pieces as well. So if I just go ahead and I paste it once again, over here, we can access the details. So that's name dot first. So this should give us the first name, which you can see Clara, and it will change on every refresh, as you can see. So whenever you save the file and it reloads, the data will change. Then we want the image of the user. So that should be instead of this image part. Let's actually add that in. And then we have to be very careful with the structure again. So results is there, and then instead of dot name, so dot picture dot large, and hopefully this way the image shows up as well. And we can keep the same name as the title, so I can replace that as well. And now you can see the image also shows up. So if we just change something here, let's say instead of first we add last, head back to the browser, you can see the data is changing, right? Now if you manually try to reload it, that could lead to a problem, but as long as it is automatically reloading based on some changes, we should be good. For example, let's say with the first name we also want to add the last name, so we can just set that up like this and remove the bracket there. And then we should now see first name plus last name. We can also probably add a space like so. And then again, the data will change. And that's it. This is how we can put everything together and fetch API data using ReactJS. If you found the video useful, do like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content on programming and web development. Thank you so much for stopping by. I'll see you in the next one.